Hi everyone, it is the hottest day of the year. It is 36 degrees. I've had to turn off the fan so that you can hear me for this video. We do not have aircon in the UK. I also have 23 books to talk to you about today, and I have a health condition which means that my body cannot regulate its own temperature. So this feels like a challenge in and of itself, and I am ready for it. Let's see if I have to film this in several bits. If I have to come back at some point and I'm drenched, please know it's because I had to go and stand in the shower. But never mind, let's get on and see how many books I can talk about before I have to take a break. I read a lot in July. This is the best reading month I've had, not just in terms of a volume of books, but there were some brilliant books I read in July as well. The best reading month I've had in however long, perhaps even ever. I did a reading challenge where I just challenged myself 2 weeks ago, where I decided to read 10 short books in the space of a weekend, and I vlogged that, so I'll link that in the description box down below. I also had a week away from my desk last month as well, and I filled that mostly with reading. So let's talk about the books. I will list all of them in the description box down below in case you missed any of the titles. One of the first books that I read in July was Bluebird, Bluebird by Attica Locke. If you've been following me for a while, you will know that I adored the Frida Klein series by Nikki French, and I've been looking for a new crime series to sink my teeth into. This has satisfied that. It has fulfilled that criteria. The only thing that's sad about this is that the second book only just came out in paperback. It's being written now, so we're not going to have the whole series for a while, but it does mean that everything feels very relevant too. So yeah, highly recommend this book. Very much literary crime fiction. If you would like beautifully written, but still it has a pace to it. It's not really fast paced, but it definitely has a pace to it. Then try this book. This is about a Black Texas Ranger called Darren Matthews. At the beginning of the book, he's on probation. He has some marriage problems. So all of these stereotypical issues have been thrown at our main protagonist. And that could feel cliched, but it didn't really, because everything else felt very nuanced and acute and believable. So all balanced out. A friend tips him off about 2 murders that have happened in a small town, and he goes to investigate. It's the murder of 1 white woman and 1 black man, and it's really investigating the racism of this town, but also the racism within the police force as well, which is not often talked about in crime novels and is obviously really important. Yeah, I guessed part of the crime and who had done it, but not all of it. And I think that's really what you want in a crime book. You want to be able to pat yourself on the back because you've put together some clues, done some mystery solving, but also you want to be surprised as well. It was great. I then read Salt on Your Tongue by Charlotte Runcie. This was one of the picks for my Patreon book club. I'll link my Patreon down below if you're interested in signing up. This is a non-fiction book where she's exploring women's relationship with the sea through literature, but it's also part memoir. And she's writing this as she becomes pregnant, and she's talking about her child swimming in her body and just linking that in with all of the different stories that she can think of to do with the sea and folklore. I think I particularly loved this book, one, because I miss the sea, I grew up by the sea, and I love folklore. Another very specific personal reason I feel like I love this book is because most, if not all, of the places that she talked about are places that I've been. So she talks about Edinburgh, where I lived for 4 years. She talks about the Isle of Arran, where we went last year. She specifically talks about an incident on the mountain of Goatfell, which I have climbed. I will insert a picture here. And yeah, she talks about various different places that I've been to and have loved. But I think you would be able to picture those places even if you hadn't been there. My one criticism of this book is that I wanted more memoir. And that may be because I've done a deep dive into folklore and facts to do with the sea. If you've read my short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, particularly the last story, Bright White Hearts, you will see how much research I've done into the sea. So maybe that was part of it, in that I knew a lot of the factual things she was talking about, so I was more drawn to the memoir. But I also feel like that was deliberate, in that she was teasing you, especially towards the end of the book when she's expecting her child to arrive. She really wants the child to arrive and it's not happening, and so she keeps on giving you more facts to delay the arrival of the child, because that's how she felt in her life, and that was both frustrating for her and then for you as a reader. The next 2 books I included in my best books of 2020 so far video, so I'll only very briefly mention them here. The first one is another non-fiction book called In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. This is a series of vignettes where she is exploring her past within an abusive queer relationship, and she's dissecting it as if she were dissecting a story or a series of narratives, and indeed how they are stories and series of narratives because we each build up our own narratives, and that's how we protect ourselves. We tell ourselves stories to make situations okay, and society tells us stories on which we build our own lives too. So if you're interested in the deconstruction of narratives, or if you're interested in folklore, very poetic writing, and an investigation into abusive queer relationships, then I would recommend that. She's talking about how society often views queer relationships as, especially between two women, as some kind of utopia, and how obviously that is something that can never be upheld because people are complicated. I also really enjoyed Braised Pork by Anne Yu. This is a novel that is set in Beijing, and it's very allegorical. If you have read and loved Jane Eyre, then you will notice lots of references to Jane Eyre in this book. The protagonist, Gia, her mother had been reading Jane Eyre when she went missing, and we find that out much later. We open with Gia finding her husband in the bath and he's dead. He has died as though he's been diving into the bath, and he has a crumpled piece of paper in his hand where he's drawn a merman. And so she spends her time trying to work out what this image means, and it's all about feeling trapped within the walls that society puts around us, how buildings can feel like aquariums. She goes to the local bar to talk to the barman, and she downs lots of liquid in order to try and understand this water imagery, and then goes on this quest. It's all about the duality of self, which is highlighted by that image of the merman, of being two separate things at once that contradict each other, and trying to learn how to exist in different spaces. On a separate note, and relevant to this book, if you're interested in the history of The Little Mermaid, which also discusses all of these things, I will link my Fairy Tales with Jen video where I talk about the history of The Little Mermaid. And speaking of fairy tales, two other books which I'll just briefly hold up and show you that I have been reading, mostly for writing research this month, but also for future episodes of Fairy Tales with Jen, which I promise are coming, are these two Penguin classics here. So we have The Turnip Princess and Other Newly Discovered Fairy Tales by Franz Xaver von Schönwerth, and this is translated from the German by Maria Tartar. And then I've also been revisiting Tale of Tales by Giambattista Basile, which is translated from the Italian by Nancy L. Canepa. And both of these books are fascinating. I would say that they're particularly fascinating if you're interested in researching the history of fairy tales, because some of them do feel as though they are especially in this one, they are tales that have very repetitive elements to them because of the collective works of one person who's been researching. Can you hear that playing? Who's been researching lots of oral folk tales around them. You will get the same feeling if you read the complete works of the Grimms, for instance. There is so much crossover to do with fairy tales, which again I've spoken about in my series Fairy Tales with Jen, but they are very gory and very ridiculous and go off in all kinds of tangents in different directions. I will say that the Tale of Tales is very different to other collection of fairy tales in the sense that it's like the Decameron. It is stories within stories, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and if the book itself doesn't entice you, then I would really recommend checking out the film, which came out a few years ago, because it was so beautifully shot. The next book, let's talk about this one. This is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, which is another book that I read for our Patreon book club. And I was really sad to say that I didn't love this book, and I had thought I was going to absolutely adore it because I love his poetry. And there are elements of this book that are so beautiful, and there are lines that honestly shouldn't be allowed to exist because they're so outrageously gorgeous. Let me find you an example. And what do you do to a boy like that but turn yourself into a doorway, a place he can go through again and again, each time entering the same room? Yes, I wanted it all. I drove my face into him as if into a climate, the autobiography of a season. I mean, just frame that and put it on a wall. Like it's amazing, and you can read this and know that he's a poet. But I think one of the reasons that I felt a disconnect with this book is because the themes that he explores in here, which are about inherited trauma and about being queer in a family who don't accept that, and about immigration, about writing to a mother who can't read, and the irony and the solace that you can find within that, All of that is explored in his poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds. He's definitely saying a lot more things in here. This is a much bigger text, but I think because first and foremost I came to him through poetry, that's the thing of his that I connect with the most. And therefore, I don't know, I enjoyed this book and I appreciated this book. I just didn't absolutely fall head over heels in love with it as I did with his poetry, which I also reread this month just to kind of get back to the thing of his that I loved and remind myself why and how I love his poetry so much. I'm very glad, and this is something that we talked about in the Patreon book club chat, that this exists, because a lot of people replied saying that they just don't like reading poetry very much, and therefore this is much more accessible to them, and they're so grateful that they can access the brilliant points that he's making and the way his mind thinks in a form that they can connect with more. So I think there's clearly something here for everybody. If you're more into novels, then this is for you, and if you're more into poetry, then perhaps this is for you. And there will be some people who love both. I'm just unfortunately not one of those people. Let me mention the 10 books that I read in that weekend that I spoke about a couple of weekends ago, and I will link that video, as I said, in the description box down below. So I read The Cook by Amelie de Kerangal, which is a French novel translated into English by Sam Taylor. I have loved previous novels by her, especially The Heart or Men the Living, and this again I enjoyed but I didn't love. I think I enjoyed dissecting it and trying to work out what it was doing more than the text itself, which can be fun as an exercise, but I think that books like that don't ever tend to be your ultimate favourites. So this is about Marrow, and his life is being narrated by an unnamed woman. And what I particularly adored about this is that we don't know why she's observing him or following him around, because at the beginning she doesn't seem to know him on a personal level. She's watching him out the window, she's going to the restaurants that he works in, she's tasting his food, and we get this brilliant sentence where it says something like she's waiting for him to come out of the kitchen and she's reading a thriller. It's almost like she's stalking him, and there's this sinister edge to it, but then you lose yourself in the beautiful descriptions of food, but it does feel like she's trying to consume him. And eventually she does become his friend, and they have this relationship together that is more reciprocal, but it still ends up feeling uneasy. It's like she's trying to dissect him and work out, without sounding cliched and ridiculous, the recipe that makes up who he is. I also read At the Edge of the Wood by Masatsugu Ono, and this is translated from the Japanese by Juliet Winters Carpenter. I have since purchased more books in this series. They also do a series of pamphlets that have been translated from the Korean into English, and I've bought those specifically for Women in Translation Month, and I'll make another video about that soon. These are 2 short stories about a father and a son in a forest and the strange things that happen to them. I like them. I think I'm more excited by the other pamphlets in the series. Next, I read The White Book by Kang, which is translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. This is an exploration of the colour white, but mainly focusing on how whiteness in Korean culture is linked with grief. She is writing about her sister, who was born a few years before Kang herself was, but was born prematurely and didn't survive. And through this text, she's giving her sister a voice, a life. She's imagining her walking through the landscape, encountering other white things like her. It feels like a series of ghost poems. It's not my favourite of her books. My favourite of hers remains The Vegetarian, but I really like the different direction that she took with this one. I also read The Face by Ruth Ozeki. I've read all of her novels and loved them. This is a fun, short exercise where she challenges herself to stare at her reflection for 3 hours and record every thought that she has. Some of those thoughts are really self-conscious and are, you know, this is ridiculous, what am I doing? It's vain, like what's the point? And then she delves deeper and pushes past that feeling of uncomfort to really examine herself and to see different members of her family and different features of her face, use that as jumping off points to talk about her childhood and her experience growing up in Canada as a mixed race woman. She was inspired to do this by Buddha, who encouraged his followers who were afraid of death to stare at decomposing bodies until they didn't really see them as that anymore and therefore weren't scared by death. And she's also encouraged to do this by art teachers who stare at pictures or tell their students to stare at pictures for 3 hours in order to see things in a completely different way. So yeah, I enjoyed that. It was fun. A book that I loved from that weekend was Pew by Catherine Lacey. I described it in my video as Get Out, the film, meets Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. If you would like to know my thoughts in more detail, I'll link that vlog in the description box down below because I talked about it quite a lot. But essentially it's about a person who the local community call Pew because they discover them on a pew in a church. They don't know who they are, what gender they are, where they're from, they don't know their name. And at first it looks like they want to help this person, but then the more that Pew refuses to answer their questions and conform to society's expectations of how they should identify and how they should prove themselves, the town gets more and more aggressive, and you realise that this is just it's a horrible situation that's going to turn into something even worse. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. Sadly, a book that I did not love was Six Guns Snow White by Catherynne and Valente, and I actually DNF'd this one. I spoke about why in the vlog, but essentially I just found her handling of the abuse of Native American people really unsettling, and not obviously in the way that it should be unsettling. It felt like she was using it as a plot device, and it wasn't a book that I wanted to continue reading. I also read Lifeform by Amelie Nothomb. This is translated from French by Alison Anderson. This is the last of Amelie's books that have been translated into English that I had to read, so I've now read all of them. And I was speaking in the comment section of that reading vlog with some of you who had also read a lot of Amelie Nothomb, and we were agreeing on lots of points, in that many of us encountered her writing first when we were teenagers, and her voice, I think, really appeals to teenagers. She's often writing about her adolescent self. She often writes about herself as if she is another person, but essentially she is writing about herself, and she uses lots of fun devices to talk about events she couldn't possibly remember, and it is fun and playful. But I feel like that voice has kind of stayed in one place. A lot of her books now blur into one with me. And this book, in this novel, she's talking about a person called Amelie Nothomb, and that Amelie Nothomb is conversing with a fan who's writing to her. It's very meta, but it also felt quite self-congratulatory. And I just don't really know how I feel about it. Anyway, I was going to say maybe I won't particularly pick up any of her others now that I've had this realisation, but there are no more for me to pick up, so that's not something that I really have to think about. I then read Pet by Awkaeke Emezi, and I loved this one too. This is I would say a higher end middle grade book about a girl called Jam. She's trans, and one of the brilliant things about that is that whilst it's obviously really important to have books that talk about the trans experience and talk about what that means for a person, this is not part of the plot, it's just who she is. And it was refreshing to read that, because as queer people we all need all kinds of representation, so I really appreciated that. Jam lives in a world where monsters don't exist anymore, where they have been killed by angels, and you can read that as a fantastical thing. But the deeper we get into this, the more that we see that monsters are people who've done terrible things. So they're saying essentially that there are no criminals in society anymore, and they have been eradicated. And then Jam comes to realise that this actually isn't true, and the adults in her world have got complacent. She is accompanied by a painting that comes to life, who is called Pet, and she and Pet go to hunt a new monster that's in town and is threatening one of her friends. Speaking of good representation, Jam has a great relationship with her school librarian called Ube, who is a wheelchair user, and Jam herself has a lot of anxiety, and sometimes that manifests in her not speaking. So she has selective mutism and she signs a lot, and I thought that was really refreshing to read about in a book as well. So yeah, I was so impressed with this book. It is a very dark book filled with lots of difficult topics, but it's handled in such a brilliant way. It's very complex and doesn't speak down to children at all, and I enjoyed it immensely. The final two books that I read that weekend were Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima, which is translated from the Japanese by Geraldine Harcourt. This is about a woman whose husband has left her, and she feels as though he's making her feel as though she has left him. There's a lot of unreliable narratives in here, because she is a very unreliable person. She is not always there for her daughter. She often leaves her in the apartment and she'll go drinking, but also her husband is not there for her either, and he doesn't offer child support, and you're never really quite sure who is telling the truth. I mean, both of them are making terrible decisions, and she's trying to come to terms with her new living situation and work out how she can start a new life for both herself and her daughter. And you both sympathize with her and get so frustrated with her because of all of these bad decisions that she's making. It's a complex little book. There's a lot in here, and it's so well paced, very measured. And the other one that I read that weekend was All the Little Places by Sophie Shillito. This is a book she wrote in fragments when she was commuting, and it's peering in all the windows of this small town. It gave me vibes of Zoe Gilbert's Folk, and also If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things by John McGregor. If you enjoy poetic fragmented writing and you're not someone who desperately needs a lot of plot, then this might be one that you might want to check out. Another novel that I read in July was Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. If I had to book maths this creepy little book, I would say it's like Michelle Faber's Under the Skin meets my short story Plum Pie, Zombie Green, Yellow Bee, Purple Monster meets Claire Fuller's Our Endless Numbered Days. This is about a girl called Ada and her father who live in Ireland, and they live on this farm. They've lived there for a very, 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 very long time, an unusually long time. They are not human, and we never really come to understand exactly what they are, but we know that they assume the bodies of humans because it makes people feel more comfortable about who they are. Her father goes out hunting in the forest at night, and people come to them with ailments. I was worried going into this how it was going to handle the topics of disabilities, because Ada and her father can cure people, but essentially they are doctors, and therefore the way that disability is talked about, I think, is handled quite well. They can help people with illnesses, but they also are not entirely magical in the sense that they can fix, I'm using all the air quotes, fix everything. So there are instances where women will have complications in birth, where people will be born with certain medical conditions and they can't change that, and humans get very frustrated with that. So I thought there was a really good balance to be had there, and even though it doesn't delve into those topics in great detail, you could tell that the author had thought about those things, and I think that's mostly what I appreciate going into books like this. For instance, Hannah Kent's book, The Good People, and its discussion of disability in changelings just made me feel very uncomfortable. I didn't have that problem with this book. Ada and her dad often bury people in the garden, and that's a way for them to regenerate certain things and allow the earth to do its magic. I thought this was written in such a stunning way. It's very poetic. The one downside of this book is that I had guessed an element that plays a more prominent part at the end. And, not out of nothing, there are Easter eggs for you to follow to guess what's going on. And so I had guessed something quite early on. And when you're a reader, you don't want to feel patronized. If you have noticed something, sure, you can give more clues and hints towards that thing, but you don't want to get to the end and then have it all spelled out for you, which makes it makes your hard work feel slightly redundant. So there was an element of that to this, where at the end it was like, no, I get what you're saying, I get it, you don't have to tell us again. And I can't really go into detail without spoiling it, but that was the one small downside to this book. Ultimately, I thought it was quite brilliant. I finished reading At the Pond, Swimming at Hampstead Ladies Pond this month. I've had this sitting on my bedside table for ages. I didn't particularly love the beginning essays in this. It's all about swimming at the ladies' pond in Hampstead, because it was mostly about how they went swimming and what that was like, and the shower facilities, the logistics of going swimming there. And that wasn't what I wanted from this book. I wanted to know why people liked going swimming there. I wanted to know about their lives in relation to the pool, not just about the pool. But from Jessica J. Lee's essay onwards, I feel like we really got below the surface, and I hate myself as I'm saying that, I'm sorry. And the essays were brilliant. Charlene Teo, who is the author of Ponty, writes about the pond as a grounding force for her. Nina Minga Powell writes about it as in relation to all the other bodies of water that she swam in around the world. Somayer uses it as a jumping off point to talk about gender fluidity. I just thought there were so many wonderful essays in here. So if you have picked this up and maybe not loved the first couple, persevere with it, because the rest of the book book, I think, is fantastic. Speaking of nature writing, I also read Wanderland by Jini in July. I won't speak about this in depth here because I reviewed this for Toast. I wrote an article talking about the comfort of nature and our cancelled IVF and lockdown, and reviewed this book too. So if you would like to read about that, I will link the article down below. And also in that article, if you leave a comment, and so many people have left brilliant comments talking about their relationship with nature underneath that article, then you'll be entered into a giveaway Toast are doing to win a copy of Wanderland. But essentially in this book, Jini is exploring the British countryside and trying to find her place in it, because she feels as though she doesn't know all the names of the trees, and she isn't scientific enough, or she doesn't like wild camping enough to fall into lots of different camps of nature lovers. She just feels as though she has this connection with nature, and she doesn't really know how to express that in a way that is accepted by other people, because she always feels like she needs to know more things before she can have authority on any of these subjects. And I think that lots of us feel like that. She's also writing about the British countryside as a British person who often is made to feel as though she's not British enough because of the colour of her skin, and how she's especially feeling judged when she goes to rural places which are whiter places. So she's trying to like reconcile those two things. Like, she loves being out in nature, but then that's also where she can feel more vulnerable as well because of the way she's treated by other people. I finished reading 2 poetry collections in July. I finished reading Paige Lewis's Space Struck, which I've already spoken about in another video, which I will link down below. I enjoyed it. It's not one of my favorites, but there were definitely some poems in here that I adored, and I talked about those specific poems in a reading vlog. I also finished reading Queer Poets of Colour, which is an anthology, and I enjoyed reading this too, though I was slightly disappointed to find that the poets whose work I loved the most were already poets who I knew and loved, such as Natalie Diaz and Danez Smith and Fatima Asghar and Ocean Vuong and Human Win. So I didn't discover as many new people as I really wanted to, but there were a couple whose work was new to me, who I loved, and I have bought their collections. So I'll speak about those in my next haul whenever those arrive. And finally, I finished reading The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I really enjoyed this. I think especially the second half of this collection. She is exploring themes of migration in here, specifically characters who are moving from Nigeria to America, and how they're dealing with that journey, with that split, and the people that they're leaving behind. Often they have married someone that they didn't know very well, or they married someone they knew very well at home. Their partner went ahead to America, was there for several years before they saw them again, and then by the time they get to America, they're a completely different person that they have to live with. One of the brilliant things about the way that she's crafted this book is that even though she's writing about very similar situations, you don't ever feel like this book is repeating itself, because the characters that she creates feel so real, and each of them deal with their situation in so very different ways. My favourite story by far in this book is called On Monday of Last Week, which is about a woman called Kamara who's recently moved to the States from Nigeria. She's got a job looking after this young boy called Josh, who's put under a lot of pressure from his father, who makes him do lots of extracurricular stuff, is very strict, very anxious about his well-being, and she finds all that a bit funny. And she never gets to meet his mother because his mother is working on her art in the basement, until one day Tracy, his mother, comes up from the basement and she meets her, and she just is completely infatuated with her. And then every day after that, she's waiting for Tracy to come out of the basement and give her this special treatment and look on her with awe. It was just a brilliant story. So those are all the books that I read in July. As I said, I'll list the titles in the description box if you missed any. I would love to know if you've read any of these, if you're keen to pick any up. Do go over and check out the Wanderland article so you can enter into that giveaway if you would like to. Also check out the reading vlogs if you would like to know more in-depth thoughts on some of these books. I will link them down below too. If you're new, please do subscribe. It would be lovely to have you around. I hope you're having a good week, and I'll speak to you soon. Lots of love. Bye.